Okay, so this video is about fuels, specifically looking at the food, so carbohydrates, fats and protein. According to the study design, we need to understand how the different fuels contribute to producing ATP in relation to intensity, duration and type. So, you might remember from our last video, we looked at the chemical fuels. So we looked at the ATP and CP stored in our muscles. However, this video is going to look at the food that we eat. All food that we eat are broken down into different nutrients. Carbohydrates, such as bread, cereals, rice, pasta. Fat, such as dairy products, oils, nuts. And protein, such as meat, also protein is also found in things like eggs and milk as well. Our vegetables, our fruit and vegetables, are primarily made up of vitamins and minerals. Vitamins and minerals are essential for a healthy body, for cells to perform their functions. However, it's the carbohydrates, fats and proteins that contribute to energy. So they're the fuels that we look at and that help to produce and resynthesize ATP. So the anaerobic energy system uses only one food fuel, and that is carbohydrate, which is broken down into glucose and used to in the anaerobic glycolysis system to produce ATP. Carbohydrates, when they're broken down, are stored as glycogen in the muscle and in the liver. And when they are needed for exercise, they are then broken down from glycogen into glucose to produce ATP. So just recapping on the anaerobic energy systems, the ATP-PC and the anaerobic glycolysis, the ATP-C system uses, its fuel source is PC, and the anaerobic glycolysis uses glycogen. And this system is the faster system that produces ATP more quickly. Alright, now looking at the other energy system, the aerobic energy system, and if we remember back to cellular respiration where oxygen plus glucose gives us energy, carbon dioxide and water, this glucose comes from the three nutrients, carbohydrates, fats and protein. All of these eventually are broken down into glucose that we use for our energy. So looking at more specifically each of these food fuels, because each of them offers energy at different rates. So looking at, So first of all, we'll look at glycogen, fats and protein. Protein is only used in extreme circumstances. Our preferred source of fuel is carbohydrates or glycogen, and that is because we can use that anaerobically and aerobically. Okay, so that's why our carbohydrates are our preferred fuel source, or one of the reasons. Okay, moving along. This table helps us to understand how much energy each gram of the three different nutrients provides us. So firstly, if we look at carbohydrates, carbohydrates gives us 4 calories, whereas fats, and this is why we want to avoid fats to maintain a healthy weight, is because for the same weight, for 1 gram, instead of giving us 4 calories, it actually gives us 9 calories. So it's over double the amount of energy. And for healthy weight, or sorry, to not lose weight or not to gain weight, our energy expenditure needs to meet our energy intake. So if we're having more fat, that's easily going to tip the scales to make us put on weight, because it contains twice as much energy. Protein, as you can see, is the same as carbohydrates, so 4 calories to each gram of protein. This table also shows us how our body breaks it down. So carbohydrate is broken down into glucose, fats or triglycerides, broken down into free fatty acids, and proteins, amino acids. Okay, and here's where it's stored. All of them are stored either in the muscle or around the body. Okay, so here we have our anaerobic and our aerobic energy systems showing the use of glucose. So our glycogen, our stored glycogen or our stored carbohydrate, is broken down into glucose, and then that helps to re-synthesize when we aerobically, when we join it with oxygen. Okay, broken down into pyruvic acid with sufficient oxygen, gives us carbon dioxide, water, and ATP energy. In our anaerobic energy system, when we break down our glucose, it's also broken down into pyruvic acid. However, when we don't have enough oxygen, we produce lactic acid. Lactic acid is then broken down into lactate and hydrogen ions, which, as we know, when they accumulate, that inhibits muscle contractions, so performance is slowed, and we get more ATP release. So what's important to note here is that carbohydrates are used in both systems, whereas fats and proteins can only be used in the aerobic glycolysis energy system. Alright, so carbohydrates. One of the important things to understand about carbohydrates is that within our muscle and our in our liver, I'm trying to draw a muscle here, we only have enough reserves to last us about 1 hour, 60 to 90 minutes. And so if you're participating in an endurance event, for example, that lasts for over 2 hours, this is where you will need to what's called carbohydrate load, and that's when you take in lots more carbohydrates than your body needs for energy output for that day, but it's maximizing the stores in your muscle and in your liver so that you can have more carbohydrates, glycogen and glucose available to produce energy, because remember, carbohydrates can be produced aerobically and anaerobically. So when you need to overtake somebody or sprint finish, you want to use that carbohydrate because it's a faster fuel. It provides ATP much more quickly. Alright, fats. Fats are great. They have loads of ATP. They produce lots of ATP, 36 ATP. However, it's slow and it requires a lot of oxygen. The other important thing to understand is that besides fats being slow and require a lot more oxygen, they actually need carbohydrates to be burned at the same time to utilize them. You can't solely just use fat. You're actually using a mixture of fat and carbohydrate together. But what athletes try and do, say if this one's the fat, they want to use more of this and use less. They want to use more fat and less carbohydrate so that they are saving their carbohydrate for the sprint finish. Whereas less trained athletes, they are using more carbohydrates and less fat, so they exhaust all their carbohydrate. So yeah, that's what athletes try and do. They try and train their bodies to utilize the fats, because they release so much more energy and save their carbohydrates. Fat is also important for transporting vitamins, which is why it's an important nutrient within our diet. So here is the table that you need to know. You need to know that carbohydrates gives you 36 ATP per molecule of carbohydrate, whereas fats, each fatty acid gives you 147, and because triglycerides contain 3 fatty acids, you have 3 lots of 147, so you get a whopping 441 for your fats. I'm sorry, I think I said earlier that fats give you 36 ATP. I'm sorry, carbohydrates give you 36, but fats give you 147, so 3 times as much. And because each triglyceride contains 3 fatty acids, it's a lot more. And protein, it's negligible. So here we have again the energy, how many calories, so that puts it into perspective, how much energy you're consuming. And this table also helps us to understand how much oxygen between the 3 different nutrients. So carbohydrates doesn't need a lot of oxygen compared with fat, and protein needs even more. And if you remember that video of those athletes crawling because they'd completely exhausted their fats and their carbohydrates, so their performance was so slow they had to crawl to the finish line, because they were breaking down protein as an energy source, which requires so much oxygen. So protein, last resort. It's a last resort fuel, and it can only be broken down aerobically. Same with fats. Fats can only be broken down aerobically. Protein's important because it's the building blocks of our cells. So recovery is really important to include protein. So a lot of athletes drink protein drinks and milk and banana to give to restore glycogen stores, as well as protein to help repair muscle that's perhaps been damaged during heavy workouts. So this table just shows us how each of the 3 nutrients are converted to energy. So our fats, our carbohydrates, and our proteins. All these 3 fuels are used in our citric acid cycle to produce ATP aerobically. Whereas remember, it's only carbohydrates that can be used anaerobically when there's insufficient oxygen, and when we use that system, lactic acid is produced, which is then broken down into lactate, and don't forget those hydrogen ions, because remember, it's the accumulation of those hydrogen ions that causes us to. This is an important table to remind us of what fuels we use for each of the energy systems, how much ATP you get, and also the duration. We'll look at that more in another video. This table looks at the capacity of the both chemical and food fuels, and this video we're looking mainly at glycogen or carbohydrates, proteins and fats. And as you can see, we've got loads of fat energy that we can get from fat, whereas our muscle and our liver glycogen, see, we only have a couple of hours worth there. But please bear in mind, that's contrary to what I said earlier, it only lasts about an hour. But this is this table is at an intensity of 75% of max heart rate. So that's like a pretty easy intensity. If you were higher than that, if you're pushing at about 85%, these numbers would obviously drop. So about 90 minutes is, hour 90 minutes is all you've got if you're racing. So that's when you have to top up your glycogen stores with your sports drinks and your gels, things like that. This is one of my favourite tables. This shows us very clearly how much ATP we get from each of the food fuels, and depending on which energy system. So let's just take a look at the glucose, so our carbohydrates. When we are anaerobically working, so that's with no oxygen, we get about 2 to 3 ATP. Not very much, but it's really fast. It's a really fast energy system. Now compare this with glucose again, so the same food fuel, but this time we're working aerobically. So there's sufficient oxygen, and we're still using glucose. The rate is not as fast, but you get so much more ATP. So you get around 36 ATP. So the rate is due to the different energy system. This is no oxygen, anaerobic, and the blue is aerobic, that's with oxygen. And as you can see, the aerobic is a slower rate, but the glucose, same fuel, but the different energy system provides you with different amounts of ATP. And then finally, what's the colour red? Our fats, okay, also aerobic, so same as this one here, even slower, because the fat molecules take up more oxygen. So it produces more ATP, but it's much slower. So it gives you a lot, but it's much slower. So this one's the turtle and this one's the hare. So why is this important? How does understanding the different nutrients, the different fuels, help us understand performance and how to improve performance? Well, the energy systems contributing to produce ATP and the fuels that those systems use will run out either quicker or slower depending on intensity, how hard the exercise is, how long the exercise is, whether or not we've got oxygen available, and this is the big one, our fuel availability. If we have depleted all our PC stores, we cannot use the ATP PC system as much to produce that very fast energy. So, and same with our carbohydrates and fats, you know, when we're predominantly working aerobically, if we run out of carbohydrates, the faster fuel, then we're relying on our fats, which are slower, to provide us with that ATP. This video shows us that when we're resting, the two fuels working together. As you can see, when we're resting, we are using predominantly fats, because fats are grouse, they give us lots of energy, but because they require lots of oxygen, you know, it doesn't produce energy quickly, so that's why we use it at rest. Conversely, if we look at then submaximal exercise, so now we're working submaximally, so the rate of energy that we need is faster. As you can see, the fat component is much smaller, and we are using a much greater percentage of carbohydrates because they provide us with that faster fuel. Okay. And of course, at maximal exercise, where you're going hard out, fast, 100% intensity, when we are working anaerobically, we are only using carbohydrates. We cannot use fats or protein when we work anaerobically because this is a much faster system, and we can do it without oxygen. We can get our ATP, our energy, without oxygen. But we get the lactic acid being produced, which breaks up into lactate and hydrogen ions, and that slows us down. Remember, we can also use carbohydrates using the aerobic energy system, and when we use carbohydrates, that provides us with faster fuel than what fat does using the same aerobic system. So we still get our ATP, not as quickly as anaerobically, and we get carbon dioxide and water. This graph shows us how we use both fuels. We're using carbohydrates and fats, it's not one or the other, together over a long period of time. So if we read the graph, we have percentage of total energy. So this is all the ATP we're producing is in the beginning at mainly carbohydrates and a little bit of fat. Okay. However, as we continue for many hours, so at about the just over 2 hour mark, we have about a 50-50% share of both carbohydrates and fat contributing to the overall energy. So we start off, this is our carbohydrate, the big one, and little bit of fat, and then as we move through hour after hour, the percentage changes until by about 6 hours it's a complete reverse. We're mainly using fat, and a little bit of carbohydrate because it's run out. The way that we get this carbohydrate is through energy drinks and gels. So this is just a good summary
table of what the fuels are, whether it's chemical or food, and which energy system it can be utilised to produce ATP. Finally, just want to talk briefly about glycemic index. Glycemic index, oh, I haven't changed the slide, sorry. Glycemic index ranks different foods according to how close to sugar they are. So if something is like 100% sugar, it will be 100 because that's the closest thing you can get to sugar. So a high index, you've maybe heard of, it's better to eat low GI foods because they release energy, or they release sugar into the blood much more slowly, so it doesn't cause spikes in insulin. What happens is you eat sugar, you get sugar in your blood, and then your pancreas goes, oh, it's too much sugar in your blood, and it releases insulin to take it out. And what happens when you have the high GI, there's lots of sugar, insulin, the insulin goes in, sucks it all out, and then you've got none. And then you're like after you eat McDonald's, an hour after you've eaten McDonald's, you're hungry again because there's been a spike in sugar, the insulin takes it all out, and then you're left with nothing. Whereas the low GI foods, it releases sugar into your blood, from your gut much more slowly, so you don't get the spikes in insulin taking it all out. So that's the difference between low and high GI in relation to insulin. So high is from 70 to 100, low is anything under 55. And this table shows some examples of different foods. Athletes, when they're exercising, particularly in extended periods, over an hour or a couple of hours, they need to have high GI foods while they're competing in order to top up those carbohydrate stores.
so that that sugar actually does get into the blood very quickly. Here is a summary of each of the food fuels, the carbohydrates, fats and protein, and a reminder of how each of those nutrients